Daniel Martinez sat in his worn leather armchair, staring at the stack of bills scattered across his coffee table like fallen autumn leaves. At 52, his weathered hands told the story of decades spent working double shifts at the construction site, his calloused fingers a testament to his unwavering dedication to providing for his son, Marcus. The small two-bedroom house they shared in suburban Cleveland bore the marks of a single father's love, family photos covering every available surface, Marcus's childhood artwork still proudly displayed on the refrigerator despite his son now being 25. The evening light filtered through curtains that had seen better days, casting long shadows across the living room where Daniel had spent countless nights helping Marcus with homework, celebrating his achievements, and nurturing his dreams. Marcus had been everything to Daniel since his wife Sarah passed away from cancer when Marcus was only 8 years old. That devastating loss had transformed Daniel from a partner in parenting into the sole architect of his son's future, a responsibility he'd embraced with fierce determination. "Dad, you've been staring at those bills for an hour," Marcus said, emerging from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee. His tall frame and kind eyes were mirror images of his father's, though his clean-shaven face and pressed business attire spoke to the success Daniel had worked so hard to make possible. Marcus had graduated from Ohio State with a business degree and now worked as a financial analyst at a downtown firm, an achievement that filled Daniel's heart with pride every single day. Daniel accepted the coffee with a grateful smile, though it didn't quite reach his tired eyes. "Just thinking about some investments, son. Nothing for you to worry about." The truth was far more complicated. For months, Daniel had been secretly planning what he believed would be the ultimate gift for Marcus, a chance to start his own business, buy his own home, live the life Daniel had always dreamed of providing. When his old friend Tony approached him about investing in a revolutionary solar panel manufacturing company, promising returns that would triple their investment within 2 years, Daniel saw it as the answer to his prayers. "You know, Dad, you don't have to keep working those long hours at the construction site," Marcus said, settling into the couch across from his father. "I'm making good money now. I could help with the bills, maybe even help you retire early." The irony of those words cut through Daniel like a knife. Here was his son, successful and generous, offering to care for the man who had sacrificed everything for him, and Daniel was about to risk it all on a dream that seemed too good to be true. "Marcus, you're a good son," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I've been taking care of us for 17 years. I'm not about to stop now." What Marcus didn't know was that Daniel had already made his decision. Every penny of their savings, $127,000 accumulated through years of overtime, careful budgeting, and small sacrifices, was going into Tony's solar panel venture. Daniel had convinced himself it was the smart play, the loving father's ultimate gamble to secure his son's future. That night, after Marcus went to bed, Daniel sat alone in the darkness of his room, holding a photograph of Sarah. Her smile seemed to radiate warmth even through the worn edges of the picture. "I'm doing this for him, Sarah," he whispered. "For our boy. You'd understand, wouldn't you?" As he drifted off to sleep, Daniel allowed himself to dream of the day he could hand Marcus the keys to his own business, watch him start a family in a house with no mortgage, see him live the life that Daniel's love had made possible. He had no way of knowing that in just 3 weeks, those dreams would turn into the worst nightmare of his life, and the foundation of trust he'd built with Marcus would crumble like a house of cards in a devastating storm. 3 weeks later, Daniel's world began to unravel with a phone call that shattered his carefully constructed plans. He was standing in the kitchen, preparing Marcus's favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes, just like Sarah used to make, when his phone buzzed against the counter. Tony's name flashed on the screen, and Daniel's heart immediately began racing with anticipation. This had to be good news about their investment. "Tony, please tell me you're calling with updates on our solar panel venture," Daniel said, trying to keep the excitement out of his voice as he flipped a pancake. The silence on the other end stretched too long, filled with the kind of heavy breathing that made Daniel's stomach drop. When Tony finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Danny, God, I don't know how to tell you this. The company went under. Complete bankruptcy. The CEO disappeared with what was left of the funds, and the government is investigating the whole operation as a Ponzi scheme." The spatula slipped from Daniel's hand, clattering to the floor as the words hit him like a physical blow. What do you mean went under? Tony, we put everything into this. Everything. I know, Danny. Jesus, I know. I lost my retirement too. My wife doesn't even know yet. The lawyers are saying we might recover maybe 10 cents on the dollar, if we're lucky, but it could take years. Daniel gripped the edge of the counter, his knees threatening to buckle. 17 years of savings, every overtime shift, every skipped meal to save money, every sacrifice he'd made for Marcus's future, gone. Just gone. Dad? Everything okay? Marcus's voice came from the hallway, and Daniel could hear his footsteps approaching. I have to go, Daniel whispered into the phone, ending the call just as Marcus entered the kitchen. Smells great in here, Marcus said, straightening his tie. He looked so professional, so confident in his pressed shirt and polished shoes, everything Daniel had worked to make possible. You didn't have to make such a big breakfast. I could have just grabbed something on my way to work. Daniel turned away, pretending to busy himself with the pancakes while fighting back tears. How could he tell Marcus what he'd done? How could he explain that in trying to secure his son's future, he'd destroyed it instead? Dad, you're burning the pancake, Marcus said gently, reaching over to turn off the burner. Are you feeling all right? You look pale. For a moment, Daniel almost told him everything. The words sat on the tip of his tongue, begging to be released. But as he looked at Marcus's concerned face, at the trust and love shining in his eyes, Daniel couldn't bring himself to shatter his son's world. Just tired, son. Long week at the construction site. Marcus studied his father's face with the analytical skills that made him so successful at work. Dad, you've been acting strange lately. First, you were secretive about those bills, now you're jumpy and distracted. Talk to me. What's going on? The concern in Marcus's voice only made Daniel's guilt heavier. His son cared so much, worried so genuinely about his well-being, and Daniel had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. It's nothing you need to worry about, Daniel said, forcing a smile. Go to work. Make us proud. But Marcus didn't move. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat down at their small kitchen table, the same table where they'd shared thousands of meals, where Daniel had helped him with math homework, where they'd planned Marcus's college future over countless cups of coffee. Dad, I'm not leaving until you tell me what's wrong. I know you. I've known you my whole life. Something is eating at you, and I can see it in your eyes. Daniel's hands shook as he plated the pancakes, his mind racing with half-truths and excuses. Maybe he could say the investment was just part of their savings. Maybe he could pretend it wasn't as bad as it seemed. Maybe. Daniel Martinez, you sit down right now and talk to me. The use of his full name, something Marcus only did when he was truly serious, made Daniel's resolve crumble slightly. He sat across from his son, the pancakes growing cold between them, and tried to find words that wouldn't destroy everything they'd built together. Sometimes adults make decisions that don't work out the way they planned, Daniel began carefully. Sometimes we take risks because we believe they'll lead to something better. What kind of risks, Dad? The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Daniel looked at his son, really looked at him, taking in the intelligence in his eyes, the strength in his shoulders, the success he'd achieved despite losing his mother so young. Marcus was everything Daniel had hoped he would become, and now Daniel was about to reveal himself as the failure who had jeopardized it all. I made an investment, Daniel said quietly. A business opportunity that I thought would help secure our future. That's great, Dad. That's smart financial planning. How much are we talking about? The question hit Daniel like a punch to the gut. Our future. Our money. Marcus still thought they were in this together, still trusted his father to make wise decisions for both of them. More than I should have, Daniel admitted, unable to meet his son's eyes. Dad, you're scaring me. How much? Before Daniel could answer, Marcus's phone rang. His boss's name appeared on the screen, and Marcus glanced apologetically at his father. I have to take this, but we're not done with this conversation, Marcus said, answering the call. Good morning, Mr. Peterson. Yes, I can be in early today for the quarterly review. As Marcus spoke with his boss, Daniel watched him with a mixture of pride and devastating regret. His son was responsible, successful, trusted with important work, everything Daniel had raised him to be. And now Daniel was about to reveal that he'd gambled away the foundation of their security on a dream that turned into a nightmare. Marcus ended the call and looked back at his father with renewed determination. I have to go in early, but tonight, we're having a real conversation about this investment. No more avoiding it, Dad. If you're in some kind of financial trouble, we'll figure it out together. That's what family does. After Marcus left for work, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched pancakes and wrestling with the weight of his secret. He had less than 12 hours before he would have to tell his son the truth, that the man Marcus trusted most in the world had destroyed their financial security in a single, catastrophic decision. But as the morning wore on and the reality of his situation became clearer, Daniel realized that the money was only the beginning of what he'd lost. The real devastation would come when Marcus learned that his father, the man who had preached honesty, responsibility, and careful decision-making for 25 years, had risked everything on a scheme that was too good to be true. That evening would change everything between them, and Daniel could feel the approaching storm in every beat of his breaking heart. That evening, Marcus returned home with Chinese takeout and a determined expression that reminded Daniel painfully of Sarah when she'd made up her mind about something. The familiar containers of lo mein and orange chicken sat between them on the kitchen table like a peace offering, but Daniel could barely stomach the thought of food. Okay, Dad, Marcus said, settling into his chair with the same focused energy he brought to analyzing financial reports. No more deflecting. Tell me about this investment. Daniel's hands trembled as he opened his container, the steam rising like the anxiety building in his chest. For 17 years, he'd been the strong one, the decision-maker, the protector. Now he was about to reveal himself as the fool who had gambled away their future on a promise that sounded too good to be true. Marcus, you have to understand, everything I did was for you, Daniel began, his voice barely above a whisper. Your mother and I, we always dreamed of giving you every opportunity, every advantage we never had. Dad, you've already given me everything. You put me through college, you supported my dreams, you. I wanted to give you more, Daniel interrupted, the words tumbling out faster now. I wanted to give you the capital to start your own business, the down payment for a house, the security to take risks and chase your dreams without worrying about money. Marcus leaned forward, his analytical mind clearly working to understand where this was heading. That's incredibly generous, Dad, but you don't owe me anything more than you've already given. How much did you invest? A few thousand? 10,000? The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Daniel closed his eyes, seeing Sarah's face in his memory, feeling the weight of her wedding ring still on his finger after all these years. All of it, he whispered. All of what? All of our savings. Every penny. $127,000. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel watched as the color drained from Marcus's face, as understanding dawned in his eyes like a terrible sunrise. The chopsticks slipped from Marcus's fingers, clattering against his plate. You, what? Marcus's voice was barely audible. There was this solar panel company, a ground floor opportunity. Tony vouched for it, and the projections showed we could triple our investment within 2 years. I thought. You thought you'd gamble away our entire life savings without telling me? Marcus's voice was rising now, disbelief mixing with something darker. Dad, that money wasn't just yours. That was Mom's life insurance. That was the emergency fund you always told me was sacred. That was. I know what it was. Daniel's own voice cracked with emotion. Don't you think I know what it was? Every dollar in that account represents a sacrifice, a choice, a dream your mother and I had for your future. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that seemed to echo through the small kitchen. He began pacing, his hands running through his hair in a gesture Daniel recognized from Marcus's childhood whenever he was overwhelmed. "Tell me it's not as bad as it sounds," Marcus said, turning to face his father with desperate hope in his eyes. "Tell me you just invested part of it, or that there's some way to get it back." Daniel's silence was answer enough. "Oh my God," Marcus breathed, sinking back into his chair. "Dad, how could you do this? How could you make a decision like this without talking to me? I'm 25 years old. I'm a financial analyst. I understand investments and risk assessment. If you had just—" "I didn't want to burden you with my worries," Daniel said weakly. "You were building your career, living your life. I thought I could handle it myself." "Burden me?" Marcus's voice was incredulous now. "Dad, this affects both of us. This house, our security, everything we've built together, it's all connected to that money." The truth hit Daniel like a physical blow. In his desperate desire to provide for Marcus, he'd never stopped to consider that his son might want a say in decisions that affected both their futures. He'd been so focused on being the protector, the provider, that he'd forgotten Marcus was an adult with his own wisdom and rights. "The solar panel company went bankrupt," Daniel continued, needing to get all the truth out before his courage failed. "The CEO disappeared with the funds. Tony says we might recover 10 cents on the dollar if we're lucky, but it could take years." Marcus stared at his father as if seeing a stranger. 10 cents on the dollar. So out of $127,000, we might get back 12,000. Maybe. Eventually. "Marcus, do you have any idea what you've done?" Marcus's voice was cold now, controlled in a way that frightened Daniel more than shouting would have. "That money was our safety net. It was the reason I felt secure enough to take risks in my career, to turn down higher-paying jobs that I didn't love because I knew we had a foundation to fall back on." Daniel watched his son with growing horror as the full implications of his decision became clear through Marcus's eyes. This wasn't just about money, it was about trust, about partnership, about the fundamental assumptions that had shaped Marcus's life decisions. "I thought I was investing in your future," Daniel said desperately. "I thought I was being the father you needed." "The father I needed?" Marcus's laugh was bitter and sharp. "The father I needed would have trusted me enough to include me in major life decisions. The father I needed would have valued my opinion and expertise. The father I needed wouldn't have lied to me for weeks while risking everything we've built together." Each word cut deeper than the last. Daniel realized that in trying to protect Marcus from worry, he'd instead robbed him of agency, of choice, of the respect he'd earned as an adult. "I never lied to you," Daniel protested weakly. "Really? When I asked you about those bills, when I offered to help with finances, when I asked what was wrong this morning, you looked me in the eye and told me not to worry. You let me believe everything was fine while you were gambling away our future on some get-rich-quick scheme." The description stung because it was accurate. In the harsh light of Marcus's analysis, Daniel's noble intentions crumbled into exactly what his son said, a reckless gamble dressed up as parental love. "Marcus, please," Daniel reached across the table, but his son pulled away. "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But we can figure this out together. You're smart, you're successful. We?" Marcus stood again, this time with finality. "Dad, there is no we anymore. You made that decision when you chose to risk everything without consulting me. You made that decision when you decided I wasn't mature enough or worthy enough to be included in my own financial future. That's not what I thought." "It's exactly what you thought." Marcus's composure finally cracked, years of trust and respect dissolving into raw hurt. "You thought you knew better. You thought you could make this grand gesture and be the hero who secured my future. But you know what you actually did? You destroyed it." Daniel felt his world tilting off its axis. This conversation was spiraling far beyond what he'd imagined. He'd expected Marcus to be upset, but this level of betrayal, this fundamental break in their relationship, he'd never seen it coming. "Son, please, let's just take a breath and—" "Don't call me son right now," Marcus said, his voice breaking slightly. A father protects his child's future. A father includes his adult child in important decisions. A father doesn't gamble away 17 years of savings on a stranger's promise. The rejection of that simple word, son, hit Daniel harder than any physical blow could have. In that moment, he realized he hadn't just lost their money, he'd lost his son's respect, his trust, and possibly their entire relationship. As Marcus grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, Daniel called after him desperately, "Where are you going?" Marcus paused at the threshold, his hand on the doorknob, and when he turned back, Daniel saw a stranger looking at him with cold, analytical eyes. "I don't know, Dad. But I know I can't be here right now. I need to think about what this means for my life, for my future, for everything I thought I could count on." The door closed with a soft click that sounded like thunder in the sudden silence, leaving Daniel alone with the untouched Chinese food and the devastating realization that his attempt to be the perfect father had instead cost him the only thing that truly mattered, his son's love and trust. 3 days passed without a word from Marcus. 3 days of Daniel staring at his phone, willing it to ring. 3 days of checking every social media platform he barely understood, hoping for some sign that his son was safe. 3 days of replaying their conversation over and over, each time discovering new layers of his own failures. Daniel barely slept, barely ate, and couldn't bring himself to go to work. He wandered through their house like a ghost, touching Marcus's belongings, his college diploma on the wall, his favorite coffee mug in the sink, the book he'd been reading left open on the nightstand. Each item was a reminder of the life they'd built together and the trust Daniel had shattered with his reckless decision. On the 4th morning, Daniel found himself sitting in the same leather armchair where this nightmare had begun, holding the framed photo of Sarah that usually lived on Marcus's dresser. His wife's smile seemed to mock him now, her eyes holding an accusation he couldn't escape. "I ruined it, Sarah," he whispered to the photograph. "I ruined everything we built. Everything we dreamed of for him." The house felt impossibly empty, echoing with memories of laughter and conversations that might never happen again. Daniel remembered teaching Marcus to ride a bike in their backyard, helping him with algebra at the kitchen table, celebrating his college acceptance with tears of joy. Had he thrown all of that away for a fantasy of providing more than love? His phone buzzed, and Daniel's heart leaped, only to crash when he saw it was Tony's name on the screen. He almost didn't answer, but some masochistic part of him needed to hear more bad news. "Danny, I've been calling you for days." Tony's voice was heavy with guilt and exhaustion. "How did Marcus take it?" "He left," Daniel said simply. "He won't speak to me." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of their shared disaster. Finally, Tony spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "My wife kicked me out too. 23 years of marriage, and she can't even look at me. Says I gambled away our grandchildren's college funds, our retirement, everything." The parallel should have been comforting, but it only made Daniel feel worse. At least Tony had been gambling with money he'd earned jointly with his wife. Daniel had risked money that belonged to both him and Marcus, making decisions that affected his son's future without including him in the process. "The lawyers called," Tony continued. "It's worse than we thought. The whole thing was an elaborate Ponzi scheme from the beginning. There were never any solar panels, never any manufacturing facility. Just fake documentation and staged photos. We're not getting anything back, Danny. Nothing." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow, but strangely, they also brought a moment of clarity. The final death of hope sometimes makes space for acceptance, and in that space, Daniel began to see his situation with painful honesty. He'd lost their savings, yes. But more importantly, he'd lost Marcus's trust by treating him like a child instead of the intelligent, capable adult he'd raised him to be. The money was gone, but the relationship could potentially be rebuilt, if Daniel could find the courage to truly change, not just apologize. After hanging up with Tony, Daniel made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of wallowing in self-pity or desperately trying to contact Marcus, he would use this time to understand what he'd really done wrong and how he might begin to make amends. He started by going through all their financial documents with the kind of thorough analysis he should have done before making his investment. What he found was both devastating and enlightening. Without their savings, they had enough money for maybe 2 months of basic expenses. The house had some equity, but not enough to maintain their current lifestyle. Daniel's construction job provided steady income, but not enough for the comfortable retirement he'd always envisioned. But as he looked at the numbers, Daniel realized something profound: they could survive this. It would mean downsizing, budgeting carefully, and giving up some dreams, but they could rebuild. More importantly, Marcus was young, educated, and earning good money. Even without the nest egg Daniel had destroyed, Marcus could still build a successful life. The real question was whether Marcus would ever trust his father enough to let him be part of that life again. That evening, Daniel did something he hadn't done since Sarah's funeral. He got down on his knees and prayed. Not for a miracle, not for the money to magically reappear, but for the wisdom to understand what kind of father Marcus actually needed, and the strength to become that man. "God, I thought I was doing the right thing," he whispered into the empty house. "I thought providing more money was the same as providing more love. Help me understand what I really owe my son, and how I can pay that debt." As he knelt there in the darkness, Daniel began to understand that his mistake went deeper than the investment itself. For years, he'd been so focused on being the provider, the protector, the decision-maker that he'd forgotten to be the partner. He treated Marcus like a recipient of his love rather than a participant in their relationship. Marcus had tried to tell him this during their argument. His son hadn't just been angry about the money, he'd been hurt by being excluded, by being treated as someone whose opinions and feelings didn't matter in decisions that affected his own future. The next morning, Daniel made another decision that marked a true turning point. Instead of trying to contact Marcus directly, he wrote a letter, not asking for forgiveness or making excuses, but taking full responsibility for his actions and acknowledging what he'd really done wrong. He wrote about how he'd let his desire to be the perfect provider blind him to what Marcus actually needed from him. He wrote about recognizing that Marcus was an adult who deserved to be included in major life decisions. He wrote about understanding, finally, that love wasn't about making unilateral choices for someone else's good, but about trusting them enough to make choices together. Most importantly, he wrote about his plan to rebuild not just their finances, but his own character. He would sell the house if necessary, downsize their lives, and start over with the kind of partnership he should have offered from the beginning. Daniel didn't send the letter. Instead, he folded it carefully and put it in his wallet, a reminder of the promises he was making to himself and to the son who might never forgive him. That afternoon, something unprecedented happened. Daniel went to his construction site and requested a meeting with his supervisor, Jim Patterson, a gruff man in his 60s who'd been more of a mentor than a boss over the years. "Jim, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," Daniel said, sitting across from the older man in the cramped site office. "Do you think I'm a good worker?" Jim raised an eyebrow at the unexpected question. "Danny, you're one of the best I've got. Reliable, hardworking, never miss a day." "Why?" "I made a terrible mistake with my personal finances," Daniel said, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "Lost everything in a bad investment. But I'm wondering, do you think there's room for advancement here? Additional responsibilities? I need to rebuild, and I need to know if I can do it with hard work instead of get-rich-quick schemes." Jim studied Daniel's face with the wisdom of someone who'd seen plenty of men face financial hardship. "There's always room for a man willing to work for it. I've been thinking about promoting someone to site foreman on the new downtown project. It would mean longer hours, more responsibility, but also a significant raise." "I'll take it," Daniel said without hesitation. "Don't you want to know the details first?" Daniel almost laughed at the irony. "Jim, I just learned the hard way what happens when you make big decisions without knowing all the details." "Tell me everything." As Jim explained the position, the increased responsibilities, the challenges, the potential for further advancement, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. Not the desperate, fantasy-driven hope that had led him to the investment disaster, but the steady, realistic hope that comes from having a plan based on actual work and proven abilities. Walking home that evening, Daniel realized that this crisis, as devastating as it was, had forced him to confront truths about himself that he'd been avoiding for years. He'd been so terrified of not providing enough for Marcus that he'd forgotten to ask what Marcus actually wanted from him. Maybe, if Marcus ever gave him the chance, Daniel could learn to be the father his son truly needed, not the provider of grand gestures and financial security, but the partner who respected his intelligence, valued his opinions, and trusted him enough to face life's challenges together. But first, Marcus would have to come home. And Daniel was beginning to understand that might never happen unless he proved he'd truly learned from his catastrophic mistake. 2 weeks into his new role as site foreman, Daniel was discovering that honest work, while not glamorous, provided a satisfaction that his desperate investment schemes never could. The downtown construction project was demanding, 12-hour days coordinating subcontractors, ensuring safety protocols, and solving problems that seemed to multiply faster than he could address them. But each evening, he came home exhausted in a way that felt earned rather than defeated. The house remained painfully quiet. Marcus's room stood exactly as he'd left it, and Daniel found himself unconsciously setting 2 places at the breakfast table before remembering he was alone. He'd heard through mutual acquaintances that Marcus was staying at his college friend Jake's apartment across town, but beyond that, his son remained a ghost in Daniel's life. What Daniel didn't know was that Marcus was struggling with his own internal war. The young man's anger had been sustaining him for the first week, providing a clear narrative where he was the wronged party and his father was the villain. But as the days passed, that simple story began to complicate itself with memories and doubts that Marcus found increasingly difficult to ignore. Marcus had spent the weekend helping Jake move into a new apartment, and the physical labor reminded him of countless projects he'd done alongside his father over the years. Teaching him to use tools, showing him how to fix the leaky faucet in the bathroom, working together to build the deck behind their house, Daniel had always been patient, encouraging, and generous with his knowledge. "You're being pretty quiet for someone who's supposed to be helping me move," Jake observed, setting down a box of books and studying his friend's distracted expression. Marcus looked up from the couch he'd been mindlessly staring at instead of lifting. "Sorry, man. Just thinking about my dad." "The savings thing? That's rough, but parents make mistakes. My mom once bought a timeshare in Florida that turned out to be basically a scam. Cost them $15,000 they couldn't afford." This was different, Marcus said, but even as the words left his mouth, he wondered if that was entirely true. "This was everything we had. Our whole financial foundation." Jake sat down heavily on the couch Marcus had been avoiding. "Okay, but can I ask you something? And don't get mad, because I'm asking as your friend." Marcus nodded reluctantly. "Your dad worked construction for your entire life, right? Put you through college, never asked you to take out loans, always made sure you had what you needed?" "Yeah, but..." "And he's been handling all the finances since your mom died when you were 8? "That's not the point, Jake. The point is..." "The point is," Jake interrupted gently, "that your dad has been making financial decisions alone for 17 years, and this is the first time he screwed up. One mistake in 17 years of keeping you fed, housed, and educated." The words hit Marcus harder than he expected. In his anger, he'd been focusing on the magnitude of Daniel's mistake without considering it in the context of nearly 2 decades of responsible, loving care. "But he should have told me," Marcus protested, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried 2 weeks ago. "I'm a financial analyst. I could have helped him evaluate the risk." "Maybe," Jake agreed. "Or maybe he was trying to be the dad he's always been, the guy who handles the problems so you don't have to worry about them." That evening, alone in Jake's spare room, Marcus found himself thinking about something he'd been avoiding, what his life would have been like without his father's sacrifices. Every opportunity Marcus had enjoyed, every advantage that had led to his successful career, had been built on Daniel's willingness to work extra shifts, skip vacations, and prioritize Marcus's future over his own comfort. Meanwhile, Daniel was facing his own deepening challenges. The increased income from his promotion was helpful, but it wasn't enough to offset the lost savings. He'd scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor to explore his options, and the news wasn't encouraging. "Mr. Martinez," the advisor said, sliding a folder across her desk, "based on your current income and expenses, you have several options, none of them easy." Daniel opened the folder to find detailed projections that laid out his reality in stark numbers. Without the savings, maintaining their current lifestyle would require him to work until he was 70, assuming no major health problems or economic downturns. "The house is your biggest asset," the advisor continued. "If you're willing to downsize significantly, you could use the equity to establish a smaller emergency fund and reduce your monthly expenses." "What about retirement?" "At 52, you still have time to rebuild, but it will require significant lifestyle changes and aggressive saving. The promotion you mentioned will help, but you'll need to save at least 30% of your income going forward." Daniel studied the numbers, each figure a reminder of the security he'd gambled away. But strangely, instead of despair, he felt a kind of grim determination. This was reality, not a fantasy, not a scheme, but the actual work required to rebuild a life. "What if my son wanted to move back home?" Daniel asked. "Would that change the calculations?" The advisor pulled out a calculator and ran some quick numbers. "If you had someone contributing to household expenses, it would certainly help. You could potentially keep the house and still build toward retirement, though it would still require careful budgeting." Daniel nodded, not because he expected Marcus to return, but because he needed to understand all the possibilities. He was learning to ask questions, to understand details, to make decisions based on information rather than hope. After the meeting, Daniel drove past Marcus's office building, something he'd been doing more frequently than he cared to admit. He never stopped, never tried to approach his son, but seeing the building where Marcus worked gave him a small comfort. His son was still building his career, still moving forward with his life, still becoming the successful man Daniel had always known he could be. What Daniel didn't see was Marcus standing at his office window on the 15th floor, watching his father's familiar truck drive slowly past. This had happened 3 times now, and each time, Marcus felt the same complicated mix of emotions: anger at being watched, sadness at the distance between them, and something else he didn't want to acknowledge, the urge to run downstairs and talk to the man who had raised him. That evening, Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of going back to Jake's apartment, he drove to their old neighborhood and parked across the street from the house where he'd grown up. The windows glowed with warm light, and he could see his father moving around in the kitchen, probably making dinner for one. For 30 minutes, Marcus sat in his car, wrestling with emotions he'd been trying to suppress. The house looked smaller than he remembered, more worn around the edges, and he found himself noticing things he'd taken for granted: the way his father had maintained the lawn, the flower boxes under the windows that he'd installed after Sarah's death because she'd always wanted them, the basketball hoop still hanging over the garage where Marcus had spent countless hours practicing. This was the house where Daniel had read him bedtime stories, nursed him through childhood illnesses, celebrated his achievements, and comforted him through his mother's death. How much had that steady, reliable love been worth? How did it compare to the money Daniel had lost? Marcus pulled out his phone several times, his finger hovering over his father's number, but each time, his anger flared again. Daniel had made the decision to risk everything without consulting him. That wasn't just a financial mistake, it was a fundamental betrayal of trust, a statement that Marcus's opinions and feelings didn't matter when it came to their shared future. But as he sat there watching the house, Marcus began to wonder if his own response had been equally unfair. Had walking away without any attempt at reconciliation been just as much a betrayal? Had he abandoned his father in his moment of greatest need just as completely as Daniel had excluded him from the investment decision? The questions followed Marcus home to Jake's apartment, where he lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what he actually wanted from this situation. Did he want his father to suffer? Did he want to punish him forever for one terrible mistake? Or did he want to find a way back to the relationship that had been the foundation of his entire life? 3 days later, Marcus received a call that changed everything. It was from Mrs. Chen, their elderly neighbor who had watched Marcus grow up and always treated Daniel like the son she'd never had. "Marcus, honey, I hope you don't mind me calling." Mrs. Chen's voice was filled with concern. "I know you and your father are having some troubles, but I thought you should know, he's not doing well." Marcus's heart immediately began racing. "Is he hurt? What happened?" "Not hurt physically, but he's working such long hours, and he looks so thin. He comes home exhausted every night, and I can see him sitting alone in that house. I'm worried about him, sweetheart. Whatever happened between you two, he's suffering." After hanging up, Marcus stared at his phone for a long time. He'd been so focused on his own hurt feelings that he hadn't really considered what Daniel was going through. His father had lost their savings, yes, but he'd also lost his son. Which loss was Daniel grieving more? That night, Marcus made a decision that would change the trajectory of both their lives. He wouldn't go home yet, he wasn't ready for that conversation. But he would find a way to let his father know he was still alive, still cared, and still hoped they could find a path back to each other. The question was how to bridge a gap that felt wider than either of them knew how to cross. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, jolting Marcus from a restless sleep that had become his norm over the past month. The harsh buzz of his phone cut through the darkness of Jake's spare room, and for a moment, Marcus's heart stopped as he saw Cleveland General Hospital on the caller ID. "Is this Marcus Martinez?" The voice was professional but kind, belonging to someone accustomed to delivering difficult news in the middle of the night. "Yes, this is Marcus." "Is this about my father? Daniel Martinez?" "Mr. Martinez, your father was brought into the emergency room about an hour ago. He collapsed at a construction site during a night shift. He's stable now, but he's asking for you." The world seemed to tilt sideways as Marcus processed the words. His father, the man who had seemed invincible throughout Marcus's childhood, was lying in a hospital bed asking for the son who had abandoned him in his darkest hour. "I'll be right there," Marcus said, already reaching for his clothes. The 20-minute drive to the hospital felt like hours. Marcus's mind raced between worst-case scenarios and memories of the last real conversation he'd had with his father, those harsh words in their kitchen, the cold anger in his voice when he'd refused to be called son, the devastating finality of walking out that door. What if those were the last words they ever exchanged? What if his father's last memory of Marcus was the rejection, the disappointment, the complete severing of the bond that had sustained them both for 25 years? At the hospital, Marcus was directed to room 237 in the cardiac unit. The walk down that sterile hallway felt like a march toward judgment, each step echoing with the weight of his choices over the past month. When he pushed open the door, he found Daniel propped up in the hospital bed, looking smaller and more fragile than Marcus had ever seen him. His father's face was pale, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke to weeks of poor sleep and stress. For lines snaked from his arm to machines that beeped steadily, monitoring a heart that had apparently been pushed beyond its limits. "Marcus," Daniel's voice was barely a whisper, filled with relief and something that might have been surprise. "You came." "Of course I came," Marcus said, the words escaping before he could think about them. "You're my father." The simple statement hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of all the hurt and love that had been building for weeks. Marcus pulled a chair close to the bed, studying Daniel's face for signs of pain or distress. "The doctor says it wasn't a heart attack," Daniel said quietly. "Exhaustion, dehydration, stress. Apparently, I've been pushing myself too hard trying to." He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. "Trying to what, Dad?" "Trying to prove I could fix what I broke. Trying to show you that I could be the man you needed me to be." The admission hit Marcus like a physical blow. While he'd been nursing his anger and sense of betrayal, his father had been working himself into the ground trying to rebuild not just their finances, but his worthiness as a parent. "Dad, you didn't need to prove anything to me by working yourself to death." Daniel turned his head to look directly at his son, and Marcus saw tears gathering in his father's eyes. "Didn't I?" Marcus, I destroyed 17 years of trust in one stupid decision. I gambled away everything we built together. I treated you like a child instead of the intelligent, capable man I raised you to be. How was I supposed to show you I could change without showing you I could work to fix it? The raw honesty in Daniel's voice broke something loose in Marcus's chest. For weeks, he'd been focused on his own hurt, his own sense of betrayal, without fully considering the devastating guilt and self-recrimination his father must have been carrying. Working yourself into a hospital bed isn't fixing anything, Marcus said, his voice gentler than it had been in their house that terrible night. It's just creating new problems. I know that now, Daniel admitted. The doctor told me my blood pressure is dangerously high, I've lost 15 pounds, and if I keep going like this, I'll have a real heart attack within 6 months. Marcus felt a chill run through him. The idea of losing his father, really losing him, permanently, made all their financial problems seem suddenly insignificant. Dad, what have you been doing? I mean, specifically. Walk me through your days. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in the hospital bed, clearly reluctant to admit the extent of his self-destructive behavior. I took a promotion to site foreman. Longer hours, but better pay. I've been working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. I wanted to rebuild our savings as quickly as possible. And eating? Sleeping? Not much of either, Daniel admitted. I kept thinking about you, about how disappointed you were, about how I'd failed you and your mother. Food didn't seem important. Sleep just meant more time to think about what I'd lost. Marcus felt his anger at his father beginning to transform into something more complex, a mixture of frustration, sadness, and a protective instinct he'd inherited from the man lying in the hospital bed. Dad, you can't rebuild our relationship by destroying your health. That's not what I want. That's not what Mom would have wanted. At the mention of Sarah, Daniel's composure finally cracked completely. Tears began flowing down his cheeks as he looked at his son with all the vulnerability of a man who had lost everything that mattered to him. Marcus, I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to be the father you deserve after what I've done. I spent so many years trying to provide for you that I forgot to trust you. I was so afraid of not giving you enough that I ended up taking away your choice, your voice, your partnership in our lives together. The words Marcus had been waiting to hear for weeks finally emerged, but instead of satisfaction, he felt only sadness for how much pain both of them had endured to reach this moment of honesty. Dad, I need you to understand something, Marcus said, leaning forward to take his father's hand. Yes, I was angry about the money. Yes, I was hurt that you didn't include me in the decision. But what scared me most was thinking that you didn't trust me. That after 25 years together, you still saw me as someone who needed to be protected from reality instead of someone who could help you face it. Daniel squeezed his son's hand, finally understanding the deeper wound his actions had caused. I did trust you. I do trust you. I've been your protector for so long that I didn't know how to be your partner. Then learn, Marcus said simply. Learn how to be my partner. Learn how to include me in decisions that affect both of us. Learn how to ask for help when you need it instead of working yourself into a hospital bed. The conversation that followed was unlike any they'd ever had. For the first time in Marcus's adult life, Daniel spoke to him as an equal, sharing his fears about aging, his guilt over losing Sarah so young, his terror of not being enough for the son who meant everything to him. Marcus, in turn, opened up about his own struggles, the pressure he'd felt to live up to his father's sacrifices, his fear of disappointing the man who had given up so much for his future, his guilt over walking away when Daniel needed him most. Marcus, Daniel said as the dawnlight began filtering through the hospital window, if you can forgive me, if you can give me another chance, I want to do this differently. I want us to face whatever comes next together. As partners. I'd like that, Dad, Marcus said, and for the first time in weeks, both men smiled. But even as they began to bridge the emotional gap between them, the practical realities of their situation remained unchanged. Daniel's health crisis had only compounded their financial problems, medical bills, lost work time, and the recognition that Daniel couldn't continue the punishing schedule he'd been maintaining. "Dad, we need to talk about the real situation," Marcus said, his analytical mind beginning to engage with their challenges. "Your health, our finances, the house. We need to make some hard decisions, but we need to make them together." Daniel nodded, finally ready to face reality with his son beside him instead of trying to shield him from it. But neither of them could have predicted that in just 3 days, a crumpled lottery ticket would transform everything they thought they knew about their future. The crisis had brought them back together, but their greatest test was still to come. 3 days after Daniel's release from the hospital, Marcus sat at their kitchen table with a laptop, financial documents, and 2 cups of coffee, a scene that echoed their breakfast conversations from years past, but with a fundamental difference. This time, they were approaching their problems as partners. "Okay, Dad, let's look at this realistically," Marcus said, adjusting his reading glasses as he reviewed the spreadsheet he'd created. "The medical bills add about $8,000 to our debt, but I've negotiated a payment plan that spreads it over 2 years. Daniel watched his son work with a mixture of pride and wonder. This was what he'd missed by trying to handle everything alone: Marcus's sharp analytical mind, his professional experience, his ability to transform overwhelming problems into manageable steps. "The house equity gives us options," Marcus continued, "but before we make any major decisions, I think we need to establish some new ground rules for how we handle money and major life choices." "I'm listening," Daniel said, and he truly was. The man who had spent weeks working himself into exhaustion trying to fix things alone was finally ready to learn a different way. "First rule, no financial decision over $500 gets made without both of us discussing it. That goes for both of us, not just you." Daniel nodded. "Agreed." "What's the second rule?" "Second rule, we're honest about our fears and concerns instead of trying to protect each other from them. You were afraid I couldn't handle the stress of our financial situation, so you made decisions alone. I was afraid of being seen as ungrateful, so I never told you that I wanted more input in our family's financial planning." The admission surprised Daniel. "You wanted more input? Why didn't you ever say anything?" Marcus set down his coffee cup and leaned back in his chair. "Because you were the dad who had everything under control. You'd been handling all the finances since Mom died, making good decisions, keeping us stable. I didn't want to seem like I was questioning your judgment or trying to take over. Marcus, you have a degree in finance and work as a professional analyst. Your judgment on money matters is probably better than mine. Maybe, but this isn't just about financial expertise. It's about partnership, communication, and trust. We both made mistakes, Dad. You by excluding me by not speaking up sooner." The conversation continued for hours, covering not just their immediate financial crisis but the patterns of communication they'd developed over the years. Daniel began to understand how his desire to be the perfect provider had actually prevented Marcus from becoming a full partner in their family's decisions. "There's something else we need to talk about," Marcus said as the afternoon light began to fade. "Your health. The doctor was clear, you can't go back to the schedule you were keeping." "I know," Daniel admitted. "But Marcus, without the overtime, without pushing myself to maximize every opportunity, I don't see how we rebuild. The math doesn't work." "That's where partnership comes in," Marcus said with a slight smile. "I've been thinking about this, and I have a proposal. But I need you to hear me out completely before you respond." Daniel nodded, remembering his promise to include Marcus in their decision-making process. "I want to move back home," Marcus said. "Not temporarily, not as some kind of rescue mission, but as a genuine partnership where we pool our resources and plan our futures together." The offer took Daniel's breath away. After everything that had happened, after the hurt and anger and separation, Marcus was proposing to commit to their family's recovery in the most concrete way possible. "Marcus, you have your own life to build. Your own career, your own relationships. I can't ask you to sacrifice your independence to fix my mistakes." "You're not asking," Marcus said firmly. "I'm offering." And it's not about fixing your mistakes, it's about building something better than what we had before. Marcus pulled out another document he'd been working on. Look at these numbers. If I move back home and we share household expenses, we can keep the house, build a reasonable emergency fund within a year, and still have money for both of us to save for our individual goals. Daniel studied the projections, amazed by his son's thoroughness. Marcus had calculated everything: utilities, groceries, maintenance costs, even projected salary increases and inflation adjustments. But what about your personal life? Dating, marriage, starting your own family someday? Dad, I'm 25 years old. I'm not ready to get married tomorrow, and when I do meet someone serious, we'll figure it out then. Right now, I want to rebuild the partnership we should have had all along. The word partnership kept coming up in their conversations, and Daniel was beginning to understand what Marcus meant by it. Not a relationship where one person made decisions for the other's benefit, but one where both people contributed their strengths and shared both the burdens and the benefits. There's one more thing, Marcus said, pulling out a final document. I want us to set some goals together. Not just financial goals, but personal ones. Things we want to accomplish as individuals and as a family. They spent the next hour creating what Marcus called their family mission statement, a document that outlined their shared values, individual dreams, and commitment to honest communication. Daniel found himself talking about dreams he'd pushed aside for years: traveling to see his brother in California, maybe taking a woodworking class, learning to cook something besides pancakes and grilled cheese. Marcus shared his own goals: advancing in his career, maybe pursuing an MBA, exploring photography as a serious hobby. But he also talked about wanting to understand the family history better, learning more about his mother from Daniel's perspective, and building the kind of relationship where they could support each other's individual growth. You know what's funny? Daniel said as they finished their planning session. I spent so much energy trying to provide security for your future that I never stopped to ask what kind of future you actually wanted. And I spent so much energy being grateful for what you provided that I never told you what I might want to contribute, Marcus replied. That evening, they began the practical work of their new partnership. Marcus moved his belongings back into his childhood room, but they rearranged the common spaces to reflect their new dynamic. The kitchen table became a shared workspace where they could review bills, plan budgets, and discuss major decisions. They set up a simple system for tracking shared expenses and created a schedule for household responsibilities that recognized both of their work commitments. Most importantly, they established what Marcus called weekly check-ins, Sunday evening conversations where they could discuss any concerns, celebrate successes, and adjust their plans based on new information. This feels different, Daniel observed as they shared their first dinner together in over a month. Good different. It should feel different, Marcus agreed. We're building something new instead of trying to recreate something that wasn't working perfectly before. The healing wasn't instant or complete. There were moments when Daniel defaulted to his old pattern of trying to handle problems alone, and times when Marcus held back from offering opinions because he didn't want to seem critical. But now they had a framework for addressing these issues when they arose, rather than letting them fester into larger problems. 2 weeks into their new arrangement, Daniel received a call from Jim Patterson at the construction site. His boss had found a way to modify Daniel's responsibilities that would allow him to maintain his foreman's salary while working more reasonable hours. It's not charity, Jim explained when Daniel expressed concern about accepting special treatment. We need someone with your experience training the new guys, and that's a day shift, 40-hour-a-week job. You'd be doing us a favor. When Daniel shared the news with Marcus that evening, his son's response captured the essence of their new relationship. That's great, Dad. Now let's talk about how this changes our financial projections and whether it opens up any new opportunities for us. The crisis that had nearly destroyed their relationship was slowly transforming into the foundation for something stronger. They were learning to be partners, to trust each other with both vulnerabilities and strengths, and to build a future based on shared decisions rather than individual sacrifices. But neither of them could have imagined that their greatest test, and their most unexpected blessing, was just days away, hidden in the form of a crumpled lottery ticket that Daniel had bought weeks ago and forgotten in the pocket of his work jacket. It was a Saturday morning 3 weeks into their new partnership when Marcus discovered the lottery ticket that would change everything. He was helping Daniel organize his work clothes for laundry when his fingers found the crumpled piece of paper in the pocket of his father's old construction jacket. "Dad, you've got a lottery ticket in here," Marcus called out, holding up the wrinkled slip. "From?" He squinted at the faded date. "From 6 weeks ago. The night before you told me about the investment." Daniel looked up from folding clothes, his expression shifting to one of recognition and regret. "I remember that ticket. I bought it with my last few dollars before everything fell apart. Felt like such a fool afterward, spending money on fantasies when our real world was about to collapse." "Have you checked it?" "Marcus, what's the point? The odds of winning anything significant are astronomical, and I've learned my lesson about counting on unrealistic hopes." But Marcus was already pulling out his phone, navigating to the state lottery website. Something about his father's resigned attitude toward the ticket bothered him, not because he believed it was a winner, but because he recognized the defeated mindset that had contributed to Daniel's health crisis. "Dad, part of our new partnership is that we don't dismiss possibilities without investigating them. Even lottery tickets." Marcus began entering the numbers from the ticket into the website. "Besides, it'll take 30 seconds to check, and then we can throw it away with clear consciences." Daniel continued folding laundry, but Marcus's methodical approach reminded him of why his son was so successful in his financial career. Marcus never made assumptions, he verified information, checked details, and made decisions based on facts rather than emotions. "The numbers are 07, 23, 31, 44, 52, and the Powerball is 18, Marcus read aloud as he typed. Drawing date was. He paused, his finger hovering over the final entry field. "Dad, this is from the night of the big jackpot. The one that made all the news because nobody claimed it for weeks." "Marcus, please don't build this up into something it's not. I've had enough of false hope to last a lifetime." But Marcus had already hit the check ticket button, and the loading screen seemed to take forever. When the results appeared, Marcus stared at his phone in absolute silence for so long that Daniel stopped folding clothes and looked over at him. "Son, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Marcus's face had gone completely pale, his eyes fixed on the screen with an expression of total disbelief. He tried to speak several times, but no words came out. "Marcus, you're scaring me. What does it say?" Finally, Marcus found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Dad, you need to sit down. Just tell me, son. How much did we lose? $5? 20? We didn't lose anything, Dad." Marcus's voice was shaking now. "We won. We won the jackpot. $1 million. The words hung in the air between them like something from a dream. Daniel stared at his son, certain he'd misheard or that Marcus was making some kind of joke. "That's not possible," Daniel said slowly. "People like us don't win the lottery. Working-class guys who make terrible investment decisions don't get million-dollar miracles." Marcus turned his phone screen toward his father, showing the confirmation page with its unmistakable message, "Congratulations. Jackpot winner $1 million. Daniel's legs gave out, and he sank into the nearest chair, staring at the phone screen as if it might disappear if he looked away. The numbers swam before his eyes, and he felt the same disorientation he'd experienced during his hospital stay. "This is real?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "It's real, Dad. You bought a winning lottery ticket with your last few dollars on the worst night of our lives, and it's been sitting in your jacket pocket for 6 weeks." The irony was so profound that Daniel started laughing, not with joy, but with the kind of exhausted amazement that comes when reality becomes stranger than fiction. Here he'd worked himself into a hospital bed trying to rebuild their finances through sheer determination, and all along, their salvation had been crumpled up in his work clothes. "Marcus, I need you to check that again. Check it on a different website. Call the lottery office. Something. Because this can't be happening. For the next hour, they verified the win through every possible channel. The state lottery office confirmed the ticket's validity. 2 different lottery websites showed the same results. Marcus even called the lottery hotline and spoke to a representative who walked them through the claim process. "It's legitimate, Dad," Marcus said after hanging up from the lottery office. "We have 60 days from today to claim it, and we can choose between a lump sum of about $600,000 after taxes, or annual payments of $50,000 for 20 years. Daniel sat in stunned silence, trying to process what this meant for their future. All the budgeting, all the careful planning, all the sacrifices they'd been preparing to make, suddenly none of it was necessary. "We can keep the house," Daniel said slowly, as if testing the words. "We can rebuild the savings. We can secure your future after all." But Marcus was looking at his father with an expression that Daniel couldn't quite read. Instead of joy or relief, Marcus seemed almost troubled by their windfall. "Dad, we need to talk about what this means. Not just the money, but what this means for us, for what we've been building together." "What do you mean?" "Marcus, this solves everything. This gives us back everything I lost and more." "Does it?" Marcus sat down across from his father, his analytical mind clearly working through implications that Daniel hadn't considered. "Dad, what have the last few weeks meant to you? The partnership we've been building, the new way we've been communicating, the trust we've been rebuilding?" Daniel was confused by the question. "They've meant everything to me. Getting you back, learning to work together, becoming the father you actually needed, it's been the most important thing in my life." "Then why does this money change any of that?" The question stopped Daniel cold. He realized that his first instinct had been to see the lottery win as a return to their old dynamic, him as the provider, Marcus as the beneficiary. He'd immediately started thinking about how he could use this windfall to give Marcus the secure future he'd always dreamed of providing. "Marcus, this money means I can give you everything I always wanted to give you. College loans paid off, down payment for a house, startup capital for your own business if you want it. This is the miracle that makes everything right." "But Dad, everything was already becoming right. We were building something better than what we had before. We were learning to be partners, to make decisions together, to trust each other. Does this money erase all of that progress?" Daniel felt his excitement about the lottery win beginning to mix with confusion and something that might have been fear. "I don't understand what you're asking." Marcus leaned forward, his expression intense. "I'm asking whether you're going to use this money to go back to being the provider who makes all the decisions for my benefit, or whether we're going to use it as partners who make decisions together about our shared future." The question hit Daniel like a revelation. His son was testing him, not maliciously, but genuinely wanting to know whether the lessons they'd learned together would survive the removal of financial pressure. "This is our final confrontation," Marcus continued. "Not with each other, but with the patterns that got us into trouble in the first place. The money isn't the real test, Dad. How we handle the money is the test." Daniel looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw the intelligent, mature man who had spent weeks teaching his father how to be a partner instead of just a provider. Marcus wasn't asking for the money. He wasn't asking to be taken care of. He was asking whether their relationship would remain a partnership when partnership was no longer a financial necessity. "What do you want to do with it?" Daniel asked, and he genuinely wanted to hear Marcus's answer. "I want us to decide together. I want us to sit down as partners and figure out how this money can serve our individual goals and our shared values. I want us to be as thoughtful and careful with this gift as we've learned to be with our relationship." Daniel felt tears starting to form in his eyes as he understood what his son was really saying. The lottery ticket wasn't just worth $1 million, it was worth the chance to prove that they'd truly learned to trust each other, to work together, and to build a future based on partnership rather than one person's desire to provide for the other. "You're right," Daniel said quietly. "This is our real test. And Marcus, I want to pass it. I want us to decide together what this money means for our lives." The confrontation wasn't angry or heated like their fight weeks ago. Instead, it was the gentle but firm insistence that their new way of relating to each other would survive even the most dramatic change in their circumstances. As they sat together planning how to claim their winnings and what to do with their unexpected fortune, Daniel realized that the most valuable thing he'd gained wasn't the $1 million, it was the son who trusted him enough to challenge him to be better, and the partnership that had proven strong enough to survive both crisis and miracle. The lottery office in downtown Cleveland was bustling with routine business when Daniel and Marcus arrived on Monday morning, but their presence created a small stir among the staff. $1 million winners didn't come in every day, and the excitement was palpable as they were ushered into a private office to begin the claim process. "Before we sign anything," Marcus said to the lottery official, "my father and I need a few minutes to finalize our decision about how to structure this." They'd spent the entire weekend discussing not just the practical aspects of their windfall, but what it meant for their relationship and their individual futures. The conversations had been unlike anything they'd shared before, deep, honest, and free from the old dynamics that had nearly destroyed their bond. "Dad, I want you to know something before we make this official," Marcus said as they sat in the waiting area. "Winning this money doesn't change what I learned about you these past few weeks." Daniel looked up from the claim forms he'd been reviewing. "What do you mean?" "I mean that watching you work yourself into a hospital bed trying to rebuild what you'd lost, seeing you take responsibility for your mistakes and commit to changing how we communicate, that showed me who you really are. Not the man who made one terrible investment decision, but the man who was willing to sacrifice his health to make things right." The words hit Daniel harder than he'd expected. For months, he'd been defining himself by his worst moment, his greatest failure. But Marcus was asking him to see himself through the lens of his response to that failure. "I learned something about myself too," Daniel said quietly. "I learned that my greatest fear wasn't losing money or even losing our security. My greatest fear was losing your respect, your trust, your love. And when that happened, when you walked out that door, I realized that I'd been so focused on providing for you that I'd forgotten to simply be with you." Marcus reached over and squeezed his father's shoulder. "We're not the same people we were 6 weeks ago, are we?" "No," Daniel agreed. "We're better. We're partners." When they returned to the lottery official's desk, they had their decision ready. They would take the lump sum payment, which would net them approximately $600,000 after taxes, still more money than either of them had ever. Without trust is incomplete, and about discovering that the greatest gift a parent can give a child isn't financial security, it's the security that comes from being truly known, respected, and valued as an individual. The lottery ticket had given them $1 million, but their willingness to be vulnerable with each other had given them something far more valuable, a relationship that could weather any storm and celebrate any blessing with equal grace. 1 year later, Daniel stood in the community center on Maple Street, watching as families filed into the first annual meeting of the Martinez Family Foundation. The modest building buzzed with conversation as parents, children, and elderly community members took their seats in folding chairs arranged in neat rows. This wasn't the grand boardroom of a major charity, but it was exactly what Daniel and Marcus had envisioned, a grassroots organization that served real families facing real crises. "Dad, the Hendersons are here," Marcus said, approaching with a warm smile. "Remember them? The family whose small business failed last winter?" Daniel looked across the room and saw Jim Henderson with his wife Maria and their 2 teenage daughters. 6 months ago, they'd been facing foreclosure after Jim's auto repair shop went under due to a dishonest business partner. The Martinez Foundation had provided them with emergency funding for their mortgage payments and connected them with legal aid to resolve their partnership dispute. Now Jim was working as a mechanic at a larger shop while slowly rebuilding his credit and planning to reopen his business. "How are they doing?" Daniel asked. "Jim got promoted to shop supervisor last month, and Maria started nursing school. Their oldest daughter got a partial scholarship to community college." Marcus paused, his voice carrying the satisfaction that had become familiar over the past year. "They're going to make it, Dad. They're going to be okay." These success stories had become the greatest reward of their foundation work. In 12 months, they'd helped 43 families avoid foreclosure, provided emergency medical bill assistance to dozens more, and offered financial counseling to anyone who requested it. But the foundation had given Daniel and Marcus something equally valuable, a shared purpose that strengthened their partnership every day. "Mr. Martinez?" A young woman approached them, holding the hand of a boy about 7 years old. "I'm Jennifer Walsh. We spoke on the phone last week about the financial counseling program." Daniel recognized the name immediately. Jennifer was a single mother whose ex-husband had left her with significant debt and no child support. She worked 2 part-time jobs but was struggling to keep up with basic expenses while caring for her son. "Of course, Jennifer. I'm so glad you could come tonight. This is my son Marcus, he handles our family counseling referrals." As Marcus began explaining the foundation's services to Jennifer, Daniel watched the interaction with deep pride. His son had discovered a natural talent for helping families navigate financial crises while preserving their relationships. Marcus had completed additional training in family mediation and financial counseling, skills that complemented his analytical background perfectly. The transformation in both their lives over the past year had been remarkable. Daniel had returned to work at a pace that was sustainable for his health, and his experience with the foundation had led to opportunities to speak at community events about financial literacy and responsible decision-making. He'd become, somewhat ironically, a voice for careful financial planning and family communication. Marcus had also thrived in ways that surprised them both. His work with the foundation had clarified his career goals, leading him to pursue an MBA with a focus on nonprofit management and family financial planning. He'd also started dating Sarah Chen, Mrs. Chen's granddaughter, who worked as a social worker, and their relationship was built on the kind of open communication and partnership that Daniel and Marcus had learned to value. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus called the meeting to order, "thank you all for coming to our first annual community meeting. My father and I wanted to share what we've accomplished together this year, but more importantly, we want to hear from you about what our community needs going forward." Daniel watched his son address the crowd with confidence and warmth, and he thought about how different this scene was from his desperate fantasies a year ago. He'd once dreamed of handing Marcus a large check and watching him start his own business. Instead, they'd built a business together, not for profit, but for purpose. The meeting continued with presentations from families they'd helped, updates on their financial assistance programs, and discussions about expanding their services. But for Daniel, the most meaningful moment came when Marcus introduced him to speak about the foundation's origins. "Many of you know that our foundation grew out of a personal crisis," Daniel began, looking out at the diverse group of community members. "Last year, I made a terrible financial decision that cost my family our life savings. But more than that, I made the mistake of trying to handle that crisis alone, without trusting my son enough to include him in the decisions that affected both our lives." He could see some people nodding in recognition, other parents who had tried to shoulder financial burdens alone, other families who had struggled with communication during times of stress. "What I learned," Daniel continued, "is that money problems are rarely just about money. They're about trust, communication, and whether families can work together to solve problems instead of letting those problems drive them apart." After the meeting, as they helped stack chairs and clean up the community center, Marcus and Daniel reflected on how far they'd come. "Dad, do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't bought that lottery ticket?" Marcus asked. Daniel considered the question seriously. "You know, I think we would have been okay anyway. Maybe it would have taken longer, maybe we would have had to make different choices, but I think we would have figured it out together." "Really?" "Really. The lottery money gave us opportunities, but it didn't give us our relationship back. We did that ourselves." As they drove home through their familiar neighborhood, Daniel noticed something that had become a regular part of their evening routine. Marcus was texting Sarah about their dinner plans for the following night, but he was also checking in about their foundation work and sharing details about the families they'd met that evening. "Sarah wants to know if we'd like her to bring anything to Sunday dinner," Marcus said, looking up from his phone. Sunday dinners had become a weekly tradition that included not just Daniel and Marcus, but often Mrs. Chen, Sarah, and whatever friends or foundation families needed a place to share a meal. Their dining room table, which had once hosted tense conversations about hidden financial disasters, now regularly overflowed with laughter, stories, and the kind of community connections that had grown naturally from their foundation work. Tell her to bring her grandmother's spring rolls, Daniel said. And ask if she knows any families who might benefit from our next financial planning workshop. When they arrived home, Daniel found himself pausing in the driveway to look at their house, the same modest two-bedroom structure where their crisis had unfolded, but which now felt completely transformed. The mortgage was paid off, the maintenance was up to date, and most importantly, it was filled with the kind of peace that comes from honest relationships and shared purpose. Marcus, Daniel said as they walked toward the front door, I need to tell you something. What's that, Dad? This year, working on the foundation together, watching you grow into the man you've become, learning to be your partner instead of just your father, it's been the best year of my life. Marcus stopped walking and turned to face his father. Better than when I was born? Better than my college graduation? Different from those times, Daniel clarified. Those were moments when I was proud of you. This year has been about being proud of us, proud of what we've built together. They stood there on their front porch, surrounded by the ordinary details of their neighborhood, streetlights flickering on, the sound of children playing in nearby yards, the familiar comfort of home. But Daniel knew that what they'd created together was far from ordinary. Dad, Marcus said softly, do you remember what you used to tell me when I was little? When Mom was sick and I was scared about the future. Daniel remembered. During Sarah's final months, when Marcus was only 8 years old and terrified of losing the only mother he'd ever known, Daniel had struggled to find words that could provide comfort without making promises he couldn't keep. I told you that no matter what happened, we would face it together. That being a family meant we didn't have to be scared alone. That's right. And Dad, I want you to know, we're still facing everything together. We're still family. But now I'm not a scared little boy who needs you to handle everything for me. I'm your partner, and that's even better. Daniel felt tears starting to form, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sadness. His son was right, their relationship had evolved from protection to partnership, from provision to collaboration, from love based on dependence to love based on mutual respect and shared values. Your mother would be amazed by the man you've become, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. But I think she'd be even more amazed by what we've become together. That night, as Daniel prepared for bed, he found himself holding the same photograph of Sarah that he'd clutched during his darkest moments a year ago. But instead of looking at it with guilt and regret, he looked at it with gratitude and peace. We did it, Sarah, he whispered to the photograph. We raised him right. And he taught me how to be the father he deserved. As he placed the photograph back on his dresser, Daniel could hear Marcus in the next room, talking quietly on the phone with Sarah about their weekend plans, their foundation work, and their future together. The sound filled Daniel with a contentment he'd never experienced before, not the contentment of a provider who had successfully supplied his child's needs, but the contentment of a partner who had learned to build a life alongside someone he loved and respected. The lottery ticket had given them money, but their willingness to be vulnerable with each other had given them something infinitely more valuable, a relationship that could weather any crisis and celebrate any blessing with equal grace. Daniel had set out to secure his son's financial future and ended up discovering something far more precious, the joy of being truly known and loved by the person who mattered most to him. In the morning, they would wake up and continue their work together, helping other families, building their foundation, and living the kind of partnership that had emerged from their greatest crisis. But tonight, Daniel fell asleep with the deep peace that comes from knowing that love, when combined with trust and honest communication, creates something stronger than any external security. He had learned that the greatest gift a father can give his child isn't money or opportunity or even sacrifice, it's the respect to treat them as a partner in building a life worth living. And in learning to give that gift, Daniel had received something equally precious, a son who had chosen to be his partner, not out of obligation or gratitude, but out of genuine love and mutual respect. The story that had begun with devastating loss had become a story of profound gain, not just of money, but of the kind of relationship that makes every other blessing meaningful. And as Daniel drifted off to sleep in the house they now truly owned together, he knew that whatever challenges or opportunities lay ahead, they would face them as they'd learned to face everything, together, as partners, as family.